They made a law because of him, one boy, one loaf of bread, and one mistake that terrified an entire kingdom. Tonight, you'll learn how mercy itself once became a crime. The fog hung low over Weatherley that morning, heavy as a thought that would not leave. The bell from St. Mark's Chapel tolled somewhere beyond the mist, dull and distant, while the world below it shivered in grey silence. Every cottage roof was beaded with dew, every chimney sent out a lonely thread of smoke that rose and vanished before it reached the sky. It was the kind of morning when no one expected history to change. Yet it did, because a starving boy dared to follow the smell of bread. Willem was 13, small for his age, his hair the color of ash and straw mixed together. His sister lay feverish on the straw bed, whispering prayers that even their mother had stopped saying. Their father had died in the harvest accident, crushed beneath a wagon wheel. Since then, hunger had been a guest that never left. And still, every morning, the baker's fire burned. The scent, warm rye, salt, a trace of butter, drifted through the lanes and found its way into Willem's dreams until one day it became too real to ignore. He had promised himself he would never steal. Everyone in Weatherley feared the Lord's law more than they feared God. But when hunger becomes pain, pain becomes reason. Before dawn, barefoot and trembling, Willem stepped out into the fog. The baker's door was half open, perhaps from carelessness, perhaps by providence. A single loaf sat cooling on the sill, steam rising like ghostly breath. He reached for it. And with that small act, the chain began, a chain of judgment, mercy, and madness that would stretch all the way to the king's court. By noon, the baker's wife was screaming in the street. Bread gone. A curse upon us. On St. Mark's Day, no less. Villagers emerged from their doors, crossing themselves, whispering. Everyone knew hunger could drive a man to sin, but theft from the baker was something else, it was stealing the blessing of the village itself. The constable found Willem crouched by the riverbank, crumbs clinging to his hands. He didn't run. When they dragged him to the manor, he said only, "She was hungry, sir," meaning his sister. The lord, Sir Haldan de Cresset, listened from his carved chair, eyes cold as the iron ring on his finger. Sir Haldan was not a cruel man by nature, but he had seen too many winters end in riots. To him, law was the wall that kept peace from falling. A loaf may seem small, he said, but if one child steals bread, another will steal a horse, and soon no one will plow. He wanted a punishment that would make an example, but not spill blood. So he invented one. For his theft, Haldan declared, the boy shall bake 10 loaves each week for the chapel. Let him feed God's house until he earns forgiveness. The words sounded righteous, even merciful. The priest nodded. The villagers murmured approval. Only Willem's mother wept, for she knew what no one else did, that her son had neither flour, nor oven, nor coin to buy them. What followed was not punishment, but endurance. Willem scavenged kernels left from threshing, begged crusts from taverns, and ground barley on a stone until his hands bled. The baker's wife, guilt nibbling at her heart, left a handful of meal near his door at night, though she never spoke of it. Slowly, painfully, Willem kept his promise. Every Sabbath he walked barefoot to the chapel with the loaves, cracked and dark, still warm from the small fire he built outside his hut. The priest would bless them, his voice soft with pity. The Lord sees your labor, he told Willem once. The Lord saw my hunger first, Willem answered quietly. Winter came early that year. The fields froze, the mill wheel stopped, and famine crept across Weatherley like a shadow. Yet the law remained, 10 loaves, every week, for the church. When Willem's mother fell ill, he still baked. When the snow sealed the roads, he baked. When there was no grain left, he burned straw and bark to keep the fire alive, because the law said so. On the last morning of the year 1324, he brought only 1 loaf. The priest waited for the rest, but Willem simply said, "This one is for all of them," and left it on the altar. The loaf was black with ash, misshapen, but it carried the scent of smoke and courage. That night, a storm struck. Lightning split the sky above the manor, and the chapel bell began to ring without hands. When the villagers ran to find Willem, his cottage was cold. Only the small oven glowed faintly, and beside it lay a wooden stick he had used to stir the fire. Burned into the loaf's crust were the words, "No bread should cost a soul." The message spread like wind. To the priest, it was a warning, to the poor, a miracle. The bishop arrived weeks later to calm the whispers, but even he felt uneasy standing before that loaf. He ordered it buried, yet people came by night to pray where it lay. When the king's council heard of it, they feared rebellion, but also saw truth. From this single act of conscience, they wrote a new decree: no punishment shall demand that which the condemned cannot provide. A law born from mercy twisted into wisdom. It was filed under royal ordinances as Willem's Law. Years passed. The famine ended, Sir Haldan grew old, and the chapel bell rested silent. Yet mothers still told their children about the boy who baked justice out of hunger. Some said he died in the snow, others swore a pilgrim once met him years later near Canterbury, feeding the poor with bread that never cooled. Whatever the truth, every time the scent of rye filled the streets, someone would whisper, "No bread should cost a soul." They said the winter ended the same way it began, quietly. No one in Weatherley could tell when the cold loosened its grip, only that one morning, the snow on the chapel roof began to drip. The ground turned to mud, the air smelled of thawing earth, and life, uncertain but stubborn, started again. But something had shifted. In the markets of nearby towns, travelers whispered of Willem's Law, a decree signed by the king's own seal. It was small, buried among dozens of statutes, yet it spread through the land like an old hymn remembered in the dark. In London, clerks copied it into their ledgers. In York, a miller quoted it when his son was fined beyond reason. And in the countryside, peasants spoke of it as if it were a prayer: no punishment shall demand what a man cannot give. Few knew the boy's name. Some thought he was a monk, others, a baker turned saint. But to those who remembered, he was still the thin, grey child from Weatherley, the boy whose hunger had forced the kingdom to measure its own conscience. The change came slowly, like dawn. For centuries, medieval justice had been a hammer, swift, cold, and certain. To steal a loaf, to speak against a lord, even to miss a tax could strip a family of everything. But after Willem's Law, judges began to hesitate. When a woman was charged for failing to pay her tithe, a priest in Lincoln argued, "The Lord asks not the impossible." And for the first time, she was forgiven. It was not revolution. It was gentleness, inching through iron. Years later, a young clerk named Thomas of Ely found himself copying old decrees in the chancery, his quill scratching over parchment. He was a thoughtful man, newly wed, tired of cruelty hidden behind ceremony. As he read the words Willem's Law, something stirred. He paused, looked out the window at the poor gathered below the tower gate, and wrote a note in the margin. Mercy, once written, should not fade. That single sentence, a small addition by a nameless clerk, would one day shape an entire generation of laws. But for now, it simply rested there, ink drying beside history. Meanwhile, far from London, in the same village where it all began, an old woman baked bread for the poor. She had eyes like winter fields and hands worn thin by labor. No one called her by name anymore, but the children said she used to be the baker's wife, the one who once screamed for justice. Every Thursday, she carried baskets of loaves to the chapel steps. When asked why, she only said, to pay back what was taken. But deep inside, she knew she was still talking to Willem, still seeing his small, trembling figure in the snow. The priest who now served the chapel was new, young, gentle, and not afraid to listen. One evening he asked her, "Do you think he forgave us?" She smiled faintly. "He left us a law, didn't he? That's more forgiveness than we gave him." In London, the bishop who once condemned the boy lay on his deathbed. The story of Willem haunted him like a song that wouldn't end. In his last confession, he murmured, "Tell the king that mercy once spoke through bread." No one understood his words, but the scribe wrote them down. By the next century, Willem's Law became something scholars studied rather than feared. Universities cited it as proof that even the humblest deed may move the crown. Monks copied his story into manuscripts, some called him Saint Willem of Bread, others, the Boy of 10 Loaves. But among the people, the legend stayed simple. They said that sometimes, in the dead of winter, when the ovens burned low and hunger returned, a small shadow would be seen walking near the chapel, carrying a loaf that never cooled. It was spring when a young traveler named Agnes came to Wetherley. She was 20, a widow, walking from one village to another with a satchel of herbs and a restless heart. On the third night, she found shelter at the chapel. As she sat by the cold altar, she saw the carving of the bread, still marked faintly with the words "No bread should cost a soul." Something in her softened. She had lost her husband to debt law, imprisoned because he couldn't pay a tax on his field. In his absence, the land had been taken, the house sold. She had learned to survive, not to forgive. But here, in this quiet chapel, she felt peace for the first time in years. The next day she asked the priest about the carving. He told her the story. As he spoke, she began to cry, not from sadness, but from recognition. "He did what no one could do," she whispered. "He made mercy real." Agnes stayed in Wetherley. She became a healer, known for giving bread and medicine together. People said her hands never took payment from the poor. On her table, she always kept one small loaf, untouched, a tribute to the boy who changed the law. Years blurred into generations. Kings came and went. The world grew wider, ships crossed oceans, cities rose, yet the law remained, tucked inside dusty books and quiet memories. And then, one evening long after even Agnes was gone, a traveler rested in the ruins of the old chapel. He found a stone inscribed with faint words, "Willem of Wetherley, the boy who baked mercy." He smiled to himself, broke his bread in half, and left one piece there. Centuries passed, and the boy who had baked bread in the snow became less of a person and more of a whisper. Time in England smoothed everything, wars rose and fell, kings were crowned and forgotten, and yet the scent of bread, warm and simple, still drifted through towns on cold mornings. Somewhere in that scent, though few could name it, lived Willem's memory. By the 15th century, Willem's law was tucked deep in parchment archives. Most judges no longer read it, clerks skimmed past it like a line of scripture half understood. But every so often, when a poor man stood before the bench unable to pay, someone would recall the phrase, "No punishment shall demand that which the condemned cannot give." And mercy, shy, quiet mercy, would enter the room like sunlight through a crack. In 1482, a young judge named Eleanor Tresson read the old statute for the first time. She was the daughter of a mason, educated by monks who believed learning was the only ladder for the poor. When she sat at the bench in Winchester, she carried not just the law but the echo of the people it was meant to protect. That winter, a case came before her, a miller accused of failing to deliver grain he'd promised the abbey. His wife stood trembling beside him, their children in rags. The abbey's lawyer demanded prison. Eleanor read the parchment, saw the fear in their eyes, and remembered the line her mentor had once whispered, "Mercy, once written, should not fade." She opened the ledger and found it there, Willem's law. The ink was faint, the letters curling with age. "Tell me," she said softly, "how can a man give what frost has taken?" There was silence. Then she closed the book. "Release them," she ordered. "And remind the abbey that hunger is not rebellion." The court gasped. But by nightfall, the villagers were singing. From that judgment, something stirred again in England, the rebirth of an old kindness. Priests began to preach that justice without mercy was only fear in disguise. Monks copied Eleanor's verdict into chronicles beside the old legend of the boy and the loaf. Across the sea, in France and the lowlands, merchants carried the story with their wares. They told it in inns and marketplaces, the tale of the child who had forced a king to think twice. It reached scholars in Paris, who debated whether conscience could live within law. And though they never spoke his name, their words carried his spirit. In one manuscript kept at the University of Leiden, a monk wrote, "A law born of pity is the first breath of civilization." He drew a small symbol beside it, a loaf of bread. Meanwhile, in the quiet English countryside, Wetherley had long since crumbled into memory. The manor was gone, the chapel a skeleton of stones tangled in ivy. Only the river still flowed the same way it had the morning Willem stole the loaf. Each year, travelers passed through the ruins. Some left coins, others flowers. A few left bread. And when the wind rose through the hollow windows, it made a sound almost like a child's sigh. One evening in 1611, a historian collecting local tales stopped in the village nearby. He was weary, old, and curious about the inscription he'd found: "No bread should cost a soul." An innkeeper told him the story as it was now remembered, half truth, half myth. They said the boy's spirit still walked the hill whenever justice was done unfairly. They said you could smell bread before he appeared. The historian smiled sadly. "If such spirits exist," he said, "I pray they never tire." That night, he added a note to his journal. "The oldest law that remembers the poor began with a single hungry child. We are still learning to feed him." Centuries later, when England wrote its first laws of compassion, the Poor Laws, the Debt Reforms, the beginnings of social mercy, scholars traced faint echoes back to a medieval phrase. They called it the precedent of Weatherley. And though no one could prove who Willem truly was, or if he ever survived that winter, his legacy had already outlived every crown and title. His quiet rebellion, a loaf, a message, a law, had turned punishment into reflection. Now, in museums, one can still find a small cracked stone from that chapel, its surface scorched faintly with words almost lost to time. No bread should cost a soul. No one knows if it's real. But when you stand before it, and the air smells faintly of earth and flower, you can almost hear the rustle of the old fields, the toll of a distant bell, and the whisper of a boy's voice carried through centuries. Mercy is not weakness. It is the courage to be human,